Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. This podcast avoids stereotypes and biases in favor of the lived experiences of those we can best learn from. Now, please welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 159 of The Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. This week, I want to continue to provide for you all a glimpse into what I at least feel the field of corrections, probation, parole could look like in the future. I like to think that at least one of the reasons that this audience listens to the podcast is to gain exposure to this type of forward thinking, so as to be those champions in their office or their agency in promoting some of the themes that we discuss on the show. And to that end, you are all about to get a glimpse into the future in this episode. I encourage you all to listen through the lens of professional curiosity and of having an infinite mindset as to what the future may look like. We are going to be talking all about neuroscience, and in particular, how neuroscience relates to our recidivism reduction efforts. My hope is that you, as the listeners, are intrigued by even one or two of the subjects you're going to hear referenced in today's episode, and that you take that topic and pursue it professionally with the goal of applying even just a little bit of that into your everyday work. You are about to hear how the neuroscience literature intersects with law and criminal justice. And those points of intersection are around topics ranging from head trauma to biochemical factors in the body to learning more about the role of the amygdala in the brain, as well as references to what is known as the HPA axis, and even to factors like the nutrition of our clients. And trust me, our professional descendants are going to look back in 100 years and think to themselves, I can't believe our predecessors supervised high-risk and vulnerable individuals without knowing anything about these topics. Today, we are joined once again by our friend, Dr. Jerrod Brown from Concordia University, who's going to talk all about neurocriminology and its ties to recidivism reduction. Now, if you've not already done so, I encourage you to go back and check out all of Dr. Brown's previous episodes on the Criminologist podcast. They are truly fascinating. And again, if you want to go down some of these rabbit holes, many of these topics we have discussed previously for Dr. Brown. So good chance for you to connect the dots and get some context for this new subject matter. Jerrod Brown is a professor, trainer, researcher, and consultant with multiple years of experience teaching collegiate courses. Jerrod is currently an assistant professor, program director, and lead developer for the Master of Arts degree in Human Services, with an emphasis in forensic, behavioral health, and a second emphasis area in trauma, resilience, and self-care strategies for Concordia University, right here in St. Paul, Minnesota. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Brown back to the Criminologist podcast. Let's have a listen to my recent conversation with Jerrod on this fascinating topic, and I will see you all on the other side. Welcome back to the show, Jerrod Brown. You're becoming my regular Ed McMahon here, and I couldn't be happier with a semi-regular co-host on the show. You bring so much to the table week in and week out. This week, we are taking a little bit of a break from the normal series you and I have been on, which is profiling or doing case studies rather, of infamous serial killers and using those as a template for today's practitioner. Today, we're going to take a break from that and really look at an intriguing topic, one that has indeed come up in our previous conversations when we've been talking about other topics, but that is that of neurocriminology, neuroscience, and how all this ties into recidivism. Sort of a new frontier for many, but one that I think you and I both feel is worth giving its due diligence to. But before we get into that, as I always ask, for first-time listeners, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience, and then we will take a look at some of these subjects.
You bet. Thank you so much for having me back again, my friend. So if you're new to the podcast, you've never heard me speak before, I am a professor. I teach a lot of classes at the graduate level, undergrad, do a lot of trainings on lots of different topics related to forensic psychology, integrative behavioral health, mental health topics, trauma, brain injuries, autism, neurocriminology. Do a lot of writing on a lot of topics we talk about and have several different degrees in criminal justice, counseling, psychology, really trying to pull all of these fields together under one umbrella and then really helping me better understand the complex nature of criminal behavior and trying to share that with all of you. And hopefully it will maybe help have a little paradigm shift in the good work you're already doing. And today we're going to talk about some really interesting and complex topics that a lot of it's heavy duty medical, but we're going to break it down into why this is just as important for probation officers or corrections or social workers, case managers to understand these topics because they play such a huge role in why a lot of clients that you may work with who leave prison or jail or they're on probation or ISR or whatever it is have a tendency to continue to be in that ever revolving door of the criminal justice system.
So why don't we kick off, Jerrod, I think as perhaps a larger umbrella term, if you will, with give us a definition of neurocriminology. Let's do a little neurocriminology 101, if you would.
You bet. So we'll look at this through the lens of neurocriminology, but we'll also be pulling in some forensic neuroscience, some psychoneuroimmunology research, and a little bit on neurocounseling research too. And I'm going to weave that into today's talk. But if you haven't heard any of my talks on neurocriminology, really think of it as it's a subset of the field of criminology. It's a subdiscipline, but it's pulling in research from neuroscience, biology, genetics, neuroimaging, biochemistry, all of these things, psychophysiology, and then helping us better understand the family factors, the social dynamics, all the environmental things that I think a lot of you probably have the traditional training on. When we look at this research of neurocriminology, we're typically going to be in a better position to understand the neurological, the biological, the social, and the emotional factors associated with criminality. And it takes into account prenatal factors. We talk a lot about that. Joe and I have just really understanding a lot of these things may have origins in the prenatal world. So it's very important to consider prenatal factors. We'll talk about that today. I'll talk about the biopsychosocial model as well, why we need to be aware of that. But if you're studying neurocriminology literature, under that umbrella, it talks about nutritional deficiencies, malnutrition, pregnancy-related factors. It talks about head trauma, prefrontal cortex damage, the amygdala, biochemistry factors, what's going on in our body biochemically. I'll talk today about blood sugar dysregulation, glucose issues. Why in the world do you want to care about that? You're going to care about that after you hear me talk today. I really believe that. It's just fascinating stuff. Neurocriminology literature takes into account neuroendocrine factors, so like hormones, the HPA axis. If you've listened to enough podcasts, you've probably heard me talk about that a million times now. But also, it's just as important to really understand attachment, trauma, the impact that poverty has. The list goes on and on and on. So those are just a few of the topics that would fall under the umbrella of neurocriminology. If you study neuroscience, so if we pull some neuroscience literature in here, it's really taking into account crime-related factors through a neuroscience lens. So really understanding how neuroscience literature intersects with the law and the criminal justice system. It studies criminal behavior. It would study psychopathy, antisocial behavior. Forensic neuroscience has a lot to do with studying like brain structure abnormalities. It has a lot to do with understanding emotional dysregulation, cognitive biases, empathy-related problems, and the list goes on. And if you study forensics, you look at some of the forensic literature, it talks about the importance of truly understanding self-regulation deficits. It talks a lot about understanding fear responses and the lack thereof. So if you study neurocriminology, you probably have come across like fearlessness theory. That's something you'd want to be aware of. These would be clients that typically don't have a fear response to certain things, which is not a good thing. It talks a lot about empathy and morality and social decision-making, to name a few. And if we weave in psychoneuroimmunology into this, I know we're throwing a lot at you right now, but psychoneuroimmunology is a multidisciplinary field of study that helps us better understand the mind-body spectrum. So it takes into account our behavior, our brain, and the immune system and inflammatory responses in our body. The research is very clear that people who are in prison on long-term probation typically have poor health outcomes. They eat not well, they don't sleep. Obesity problems have been noted to be higher in some of those populations. If you look at some of the research on just health factors in prison, a lot of clients end up coming out of prison more metabolically unhealthy. There are a lot of reasons for that. Maybe they don't move a lot and there's sedentary behaviors. The food that's often served in prisons around the country are typically not that healthy for an individual. So psychoneuroimmunology takes into account the brain, the body, the interconnectedness between our immune system, how emotions impact that, how social factors impact that, as well as behavioral factors. And then the other area of study that I really draw from is neurocounseling. Maybe you're not a counselor or therapist, still learning about neurocounseling literature can be very helpful. Neurocounseling is really infusing neuroscience into counseling practice. But if you're a case manager, infusing that into case management work or probation officer, studying neurocounseling literature, you're going to be studying the central nervous system, the brain, how it relates to our body, our mood, our behaviors. It takes into account biological factors, neurological, psychological, social, and physiological factors. When I look at these these four big areas of study, I see a lot of overlap. They look at it maybe through different directions, but there's a lot of overlap too between neurocriminology, psychoneuroimmunology, and neurocounseling. It's very important if you truly want to dig deep into the weeds with understanding like neuroscience literature. Looking at these three big areas of study can be very, very helpful. And before I kick it back to you, Joe, I know I'm throwing a lot out at the folks. When we're looking at this topic today through that neuro, bio, psychosocial lens, if we infuse neurocriminology into this equation, it really studies how biochemical abnormalities like hormone dysfunctions may play a role in criminal behavior. Some of the research talks about higher levels of testosterone, particularly maybe being a factor to take into account. It takes into account head injuries, poor nutrition, trauma histories, prenatal drug and alcohol exposure, chemical sensitivities, foods, endocrine disruptors, so environmental contaminants. So maybe someone's exposed to a bunch of lead or mercury or pesticides. These are all some of the neurobiopsychosocial factors to take into account through a neurocriminology lens. Joe, I'll kick it back to you before I jump into criminal recidivism.
Jerrod, I know you said we're throwing a lot at the listeners, and we are, and I wanted to perhaps walk some of them off the ledge if they're feeling a bit intimidated. I have been thinking about this topic a lot recently, and I've thought to myself, just as the field of corrections and, more broadly speaking, human services is moving towards a space of being more trauma-informed, getting at being more, or utilizing rather, more trauma-informed care approaches, my vision is that we get to the space where we're neuroscience informed, which means you don't have to have a doctorate, you don't have to be a psychologist or a therapist, but just I see the value added of simply being neuroscience informed, no different than when folks simply are trauma informed. Could you maybe talk about what that would look like in your crystal ball if practitioners, particularly those in corrections, were simply neuroscience informed?
Maybe just, like you've said, use the model of trauma-informed care. If your organization truly becomes trauma-informed, typically, and at least in my experience, you're hiring a trainer, a consultant, or a group of folks that do trainings, have case consultations. They may be available to consult on complex cases, giving you resources and readings and links and doing things over a longer period of time rather than like you just going to a one-day training, hearing it one time, and it's never reinforced. That would be my goal is folks listen to the podcast like this. Maybe they have ongoing trainings. They are intentional about reading the literature or having almost like a monthly get together. It could be by Zoom or whatever, and you're talking about the new research findings, and then having a consultant who understands these things and breaking it down and to be able to apply it to your case, to your goal plan, to your intervention plan. If the courts are informed on this, maybe they could have a neuroscience informed sentencing decision. Probation officers could make modifications to the way in which they supervise individuals. That would be great. And there's so many things to take into account, but I think it can be done. If you can become trauma-informed, if your organization can get trained on motivational interviewing and go through 40 hours of training on that or whatever, the more you can learn about this is foundational. I think if you understood this before trauma-informed care or motivational interviewing, those would be even more effective. You could tweak those to the brains and the learning style and the memory and the behavioral characteristics of some of more of your challenging and high-risk populations.
We've talked about this in the past, Jerrod. When I think about how the field is doing a good job of updating itself, if you will, one area that I could cite would be, for example, that of the data that we collect for the courts prior to sentencing, what goes into what we refer to as the pre-sentence investigation. And the field has done a good job of modifying those investigations to get them more in tune with the risk need assessment that we're doing, which I contend has so much more utility than some of that historical legal data that goes into a pre-sentence investigation. But for example, just getting that perspective, that neuroscience perspective, and factoring in those considerations would have immediate value. In other words, rather than asking a defendant who's about to be sentenced the names and ages of all of their children, ask the question about, did your mother drink during pregnancy? Or did you ever suffer a head injury as a child? Or give me a snapshot of what it looked like growing up in your house before you went off to kindergarten. And we don't ask any of those questions, at least structurally.
Do those reports ask about like what you eat or how much you smoke or how many sugar sweetened beverages do you have or energy drinks a day and those kind of things?
No, they do not. And that's to my point. I think simply if an agency became neuroscience informed, then they might start asking those questions because they see the value added of that information over some of this other historical thing that we collect just because, and this is where my head always explodes, well, we've always done it that way, Joe.
Well, is it working? And if you look at the recidivism rates around the country and the world, it's clearly not. We could do a much better job. I'm not putting anyone down. There's just the research is pretty clear on this. So many folks end up reoffending. Maybe it's not violent offenses, but it's lots of technical things. Showing up late, getting fired from a job. Could that be partially related to biochemical imbalances in their body or their brain? Yes, absolutely. In some cases, because we know a lot of these folks don't sleep well, they don't eat well, they don't take care of themselves. If you're smoking tons of cigarettes, if you're pounding down the energy drinks, if you're skipping breakfast, your blood sugar levels crash. All these things impact their mood, attention, and memory, and a lot of factors to take into account.
And I also think, Jerrod, that without having all this information, it leads to a sense of the practitioner gets a little defeated when they embrace the current interventions. They don't see the effect sizes, the outcomes that they want, and then they get frustrated. But if they only knew that perhaps they're not seeing those outcomes because they're not taking into account the array of other variables that you just outlined. And I'm hoping we get to this when we get to the interventions. I think it would lead to better effect sizes if we had a more complete picture of the client.
Yep, and that's that neurobiopsychosocial approach. Absolutely. And there's some articles that have been published that talk about should forensic risk assessment evaluations be moving in that direction of a biopsychosocial approach. And yes, in my opinion, yes, because you guys are doing a great job, Joe. You're the expert on R&R. That's a wonderful model. But does the R&R take into account the gut? Does it take into account nutrition, the sleep, the inflammation? Plenty of studies show that those factors have a role in criminality. Now, not everyone by any stretch who has these problems is going to engage in criminality, but high-risk offenders who engage in long-term criminal justice involvement oftentimes don't live a healthy lifestyle, and that throws them off biochemically. And if they're off biochemically, their brain is not working properly. And if their brain's not working properly, it's harder to take in cog skills groups, interventions, one-on-one approaches, because their brain is just not processing information the same as everyone else.
So let's talk about those links to recidivism as you teased earlier.
Well, Joe, you're the expert on this, but we know like just the general recidivism risk factors. It talks a lot about age. People who are younger may be more likely to get in trouble with the law. As you get older, those behaviors burn out for most people, not always. There's life course persistent offenders. You got to be aware of that literature. Looking at prior criminal history, obviously, if someone's had a long-standing pattern of criminal justice involvement and they've never had appropriate intervention, supports, and services in place, there's greater likelihood they may continue on that path. What is their associations like with negative peer groups or people who engage in criminal behavior? Do they have family that they associate with and they're always engaging in criminal behavior? That's a risk factor to take into account. Substance use, having a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder, long-standing histories of employment problems, lack of social support, low educational achievement, not being able to engage in pro-social leisure activities. These are all just general things talked about in the recidivism literature. Impulse control problems, having a negative attitude, having high levels of hostility, These are all things that are talked about, having relationship and marital problems. Just being aware, too, if the person has a long-standing pattern of having attitudes and cognitions that are supportive of criminal behavior, they're more likely to engage in that. So these are all just some of the general things that you always talk about, Joe, and just being aware of the Central 8 and the R&R model, all those good things. Now, what happens, too, if someone's engaging in criminal behavior as a means of survival, like prostitution, dealing drugs, panhandling, theft, stealing? These are all criminal survival behaviors you want to take into account. A big part of this recidivism literature talks a lot about housing stability and the lack thereof. We know that folks, when they leave jail and prison, it's so important to find stable housing. If you don't have stable housing, it is very hard to get a footing. And it talks about stable housing as like that foundational thing to build on. Because if people don't have a solid house or living environment, harder to hold a job. It's harder to cook your own meals. So you're probably getting gas station food going through the drive-thru. And if you consume tons of Western food diet, that's not good for your brain and body. When you think of this too, think of neighborhood attachment. We're going to talk about attachment in a future episode, I know, but what happens if that client has no attachment to their neighborhood? Or if they have a high attachment to their neighborhood, that's a protective factor. And then employment, big factor. If someone has solid, stable employment, that is a protective factor. If they get out of prison and they can't find a job, they can't find housing, a high percentage of these individuals end up reoffending for a variety of reasons. So those are just some of the general things to think about. Now, if we start weaving in the trauma piece to this, let's think about this through a trauma lens and employment, just looking at high levels of childhood trauma that go unaddressed. There is some evidence to support the fact that some of these individuals may be more likely to deal with poverty. They might be more likely to make a lower living wage throughout life and have lower levels of education. There's tons of studies that look at extensive childhood trauma and its impact on employment and vocational outcomes. I'm not saying everyone that's had extensive childhood trauma is going to have that, but a higher percentage do, according to the literature. What happens if you're working with someone that has callous and unemotional traits? I highly recommend you being aware of that topic, especially if you're working with juvenile offender populations. Callous and unemotional traits relate to like a persistent pattern of behavior where that youth lacks empathy. They're typically more prone to lying. They're less sensitive to punishment. They have a lack of disregard for other people. They might have a tendency to blackmail people or bully others. They might have a tendency to manipulate. These are all things to be aware of when you're working with higher risk juvenile populations. And if the person lives in a disadvantaged neighborhood as well, community violence exposure, just having run-ins with the law constantly, having lack of resources. These are all different things talked about in that literature. Now, if we were to start to look at this a little bit more through that neuro, biopsychosocial lens, what about food insecurity? There's a lot of research literature that talks about food insecurity as being a significant factor for problematic behaviors later on in life. Food insecurity doesn't mean they're not going to have food to eat. A lot of times they might have food to eat, but it's food that's not good for them. So again, maybe they're eating lots of processed foods loaded with sodium and sugar and all these things. Food insecurity over the long haul has been linked to higher levels of obesity, diabetes, hypertension, mental health issues. Children living in food insecure homes typically have higher levels of irritability, nervousness, and over the long haul, these can contribute to underemployment, exposure to higher levels of violence. This research also talks about high levels of food insecurity within certain homes may contribute to more racial or ethnic discrimination among some clients as well. So these are all factors to take into account when we're thinking about this through kind of that biopsychosocial lens. Now, what happens if you have clients as children or in utero, they dealt with malnutrition? So maybe mom was pregnant and didn't eat a lot. They have a lot of nutritional deficiencies. That has been linked to so many problems, brain problems, body problems. So malnutrition histories, you want to take that into account. So those are just a few things you want to consider as we start dabbling a little bit deeper into the biopsychosocial aspect. Joe, I'll park it there for a minute, see if you have any thoughts.
You did a fantastic job, Jerrod, of outlining the central eight, those criminogenic variables, which are most closely correlated to reoffending. Why don't we do this now? When we look at some of these interventions, let's maybe go to bizarro world or an alternate reality where the practitioner and those agencies are, in fact, neuroscience informed, and maybe look at the difference between if an agency today is thinking, for example, we are solid with our application of the risk needs responsivity model. We maybe even dabble a little bit in trauma-informed care, but what's missing from that equation? Or again, in that alternate reality, Jerrod, where our doppelgangers are neuroscience informed, what does that look like a day in practice, or what might some of those interventions be?
Well, let's just pick domestic violence offenders, for example. How about that?
Perfect.
Now, you are a domestic violence probation officer. You have a caseload of folks that are domestic violence perpetrators. We know that if you look at it through a psychological lens, which I'm sure you have a lot of training in, like anger control problems, cognitive biases, high levels of hostility, more likely to use drugs and alcohol, having more problems with social communication issues. Those are things that probably most probation officers have had training on if you are working with domestic violence offenders. We started infusing in some of the things we're talking about. There is research that shows that domestic violence offenders have significantly higher rates of head injuries in their history, which trickles down into having more executive functioning problems. There's some evidence to also show that psychophysiological abnormalities are more common in these individuals, so they have more internal distress at a physiological level. There's some evidence, too, to support the fact that they may have more HPA axis dysfunction, so their hormones could be off. What would you do about that as a probation officer? Sending them to a medical doctor, having every client you have get a physical, get blood work, find out if there's deficiencies in any vitamins, minerals, getting blood pressure checked. All of these things may detect some physiological abnormalities. Digging deeper, too, into their eating habits. Maybe they would do well working with a nutritionist. There are several studies that show that nutritional interventions may be one means of many to combat problematic behavior. Tons of studies show that. There is one study I found, there might be more, but there's one study I found that people that were involved in higher levels of domestic violence situations were more likely to consume higher levels of sugar. And if you consume tons of sugar, that's like pouring gasoline on a fire. Sugar's wonderful. We all love it. But what does that do to our body at a biochemical level? Increases inflammation, throws off our gut, which is called gut dysbiosis. I'll talk about that in a minute. If our gut is off, that's been linked to more mood problems, behavioral problems. Could that be a potential factor? Blood sugar dysregulation issues have been shown to be much higher among people with severe violent behavior tendencies. I'll talk about that today as well. So those are a few things to consider. I am aware, I do a lot of work in the area of fire setting. There's some studies that have shown that arson offenders may have more problems with glucose issues in their brain and metabolizing glucose. If you work with DUI offenders, There's a couple studies that have shown that DUI recidivism rates may be partially linked to HPA axis dysfunction, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. There's a study published in 2008. I think it was called the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis response to stress in male DUI recidivists. That would be an article to check out. It talks about this kind of on a neurophysiological level. So that's just really fascinating to think about. If you are working with any offender population and you are starting to infuse neuroscience literature into the good work you're doing, looking at this through a frontal lobe impairment lens, a lot of these folks who come into contact with the criminal justice system will probably have frontal lobe impairments, head trauma issues. Half of people or more who are in prison, according to the research, have a history of head trauma. When someone has head trauma, that can contribute obviously to frontal lobe impairment. And when that's the case, they may have abstract reasoning deficits. Why do you care about that? Because when someone has abstract reasoning deficits, they have a really difficult time understanding how and why questions. So if you're referring your client to like court-ordered treatment, and it's a treatment program that uses insight-based therapeutic approaches, and they ask a lot of how and why questions, that client may not be successful in there and get terminated prematurely, which could result in a technical violation. When people have frontal lobe impairments, that can get in the way of planning and time management. So maybe you have a client who consistently misses their appointments with you, consistently forgets to go to court, consistently does not show up to work on time. That could be intentional, but could it be unintentional where they have a brain-based problem? For some of these clients with these frontal lobe impairments too, they may struggle with higher levels of disinhibition. That's basically people that lack the ability to delay gratification. They're more impulsive. They may have a tendency to use drugs, alcohol, get into fights, road rage, these kind of things. So they don't connect the dots a lot. So those are a few things through a kind of a prefrontal cortex lens. So I'll kick it back to you right now, but I definitely have more to say.
I'm wondering, Jerrod, if you could comment on right now, for example, we're making a big push to get the field utilizing more cognitive behavioral interventions. We know that attitudes and orientation, low self-regulation, which you've been talking about throughout, are really the granddaddy of those criminogenic variables. My contention is, though, and Nicole Staley and I have talked about this, is that if you don't understand that brain science, to a large degree, one can really be spinning their wheels with these cognitive interventions if they don't understand a lot of things you just talked about, the frontal lobe limitations, or even the fact that if their client isn't up in that frontal lobe and they're hanging out back in the amygdala, those CBIs are really muted. Are you aware of any other practices? I know, for example, Jerrod, when you and I published our paper on FASD and R&R, we reviewed a lot of good interviewing techniques that should be taken into account with an FASD population. Could you maybe expand on that larger into this, like I said, neuroscience-informed realm?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's put our neurocognitive hat on. What would fall under that umbrella? Let's take into account your client's level of attention. Do you notice they drift off? They can't stay focused on you. What is their level of self-regulation like? A couple red flag indicators of low self-regulation would be they just can't control their eating habits. They smoke tons of cigarettes. They're pounding down the energy drinks. They have all kinds of reckless driving behaviors. They have a tendency to always start yelling and screaming when something doesn't go their way. They have long histories of getting into fights, multiple probation violations. Those are all red flag indicators of self-regulation issues. Working memory deficits, that's our brain's Post-it note. Have to understand that. Very, very important. How do they plan? How do they organize? How do they use time? What are their problem solving and conflict resolution skills like? Those are just a few things to ask yourself. If you have clients that have issues in many of those areas, and if they're required to do a COG skills group, they may be at a huge disadvantage. So what do you do about that? The client may benefit from seeing a neuropsychologist and doing some cognitive testing, finding out what's working and what's not, getting a report. Once you get that report, then you can make modifications to what you do. So if you know your client has working memory deficits, putting them in a group may not be a good thing. They may do much better one-on-one. If they have abstract reasoning deficits and you're not reinforcing what you're teaching by using visual charts and then practicing the skills outside of that group, that would go over the client's head in a lot of cases. So you're teaching skills in a controlled setting, like in an office, and then those skills are never practiced outside of that office. A lot of times those skills don't stick. So some of those clients would do well with doing a COG skills group, but then also having like a skills worker practice those skills on the job, at home, in the community, and using maybe some scaffolding interventions, using more psychiatric rehabilitative approaches like coaching, modeling, teaching, role-playing, and finding out how your client learns, because maybe they have auditory processing issues and you're giving lectures in a class. Their brain may only be catching every other word, so they're missing things. But that client would never tell you that because they would be embarrassed, or maybe they don't even know. Some of these clients may have information processing deficits too. So if you have them in a class for like an hour long and there's no break, their brains may shut down. They become so tired, they can't take information in. These clients in some cases may need more breaks. Some of these clients would do much better with movement-based interventions rather than like sitting in a chair because they have a hard time sitting still. So making modifications to this can be very effective if you use COG skills programming as usual and you don't start infusing these things into account. These clients a lot of times aren't successful. And now if you throw into the mix, your client has an untreated sleep disorder and they were up till 4 a.m. the night before, and now they have to come to group at 8 a.m. Their brain is already lacking the ability to take in information. And then that morning when your client wakes up because they're so tired and they only got a couple hours of sleep and they overslept, they skip breakfast. And what happens there? They skip breakfast, blood sugar levels dip. That can impact mood and energy. They may be more irritable. They may be more short-tempered. Lots of factors to take into account. And then on your first break in your COG skills group, they're so tired, they pound down their energy drink, they go outside and smoke a cigarette. It just wreaks havoc on the brain and body, and it's just a vicious cycle. These are just some examples.
As you were speaking, Jerrod, it dawned on me, or redawned on me, that this is really all about upping our responsivity game. For review, when we talk about R&R, sort of that forgotten R is the responsivity principle, which, yes, breaks down into general responsivity, which, as a reminder, is essentially use cognitive behavioral interventions. People learn best when it's modeled and rehearsed. That's really COG in a nutshell. But then there's also specific responsivity, which gets into tailoring the delivery of those interventions and really endeavoring to create the ideal learning environment. As you were speaking, Jerrod, I thought we're really falling short in that arena then as far as creating that ideal learning environment if we don't take into account some of those factors that you just talked about. Like I said, we really need to up our responsivity game and really, again, when you talked about folks showing up to class sleep deprived or these other factors that we don't take into consideration necessarily, I think we owe it to our clients to move away from I had a colleague the other day that made a comment that a lot of agencies, they don't adhere to quality assurance. It's more about quantity insurance, which is really just sort of getting those butts in the seats and calling it a day. Or I would contend, even if it's not a classroom setting, even if the probation officer is doing one-on-one cognitive behavioral interventions, if they're not neuroscience informed, then yes, they can check a box and say, look, boss, I did X amount of CBIs, cognitive behavioral interventions this week. But yeah, you're falling into that quantity assurance trap. And that's what we need to be leery of.
You bring up a point that you didn't say, but you kind of said it. So you have a classroom at your probation office, and we don't take into account sensory issues too. I forgot to bring that up. So your client has sensory processing issues maybe, and that's very common among certain client-based populations, especially head trauma. They walk into the group room, there's all kinds of pictures on the wall, there's clutter everywhere. Someone with sensory processing issues, all of that clutter, maybe there's bright lights in the room, maybe someone's wearing cologne or perfume, that can overwhelm their brain and they can become very hypo-reactive, which they can shut down. It looks like they're falling asleep, or they could become hyper-aroused where they can't sit still and they're constantly fidgeting. So sensory-informed approaches would be helpful. And if any of you are doing any kind of curriculum development, running any kind of group, infusing some educational neuroscience literature into what you're doing, that takes into account their learning and the learning environment. I've actually done some work in that area too. It's really fascinating. So having a consultant come in and look at your room and maybe setting it up in an educational neuroscience informed manner should lead to better outcomes. Not saying it's going to 100% of the time, but it sure should help.
Jerrod, I'm always fascinated by the neurocriminology stuff. And the more you talk about biopsychosocial considerations, I'm always reviewing what and how we assess justice involved individuals. Anything else on those topics to maybe bring the conversation to a head?
Yeah, I'll point out a couple here. We won't be able to get into the weeds, but if any of these topics land with folks, I'm more than happy, Joe, to come back and do a full segment on any of these. But again, let's start at the prenatal world. What was going on prenatally? Sometimes we will never know because maybe you're working with adult clients and they just don't know their birth parents. But looking at some of the literature on preterm birth, that is fascinating and scary too. There's some evidence in this literature that children who are born preterm, and it really depends on a lot of factors. It's not just they're born preterm, what was going on in utero. So looking at some of the preterm birth literature, poverty, childhood poverty, and its impact on neurodevelopment. So kids that grow up in long-term poverty may have more brain-based problems. There's a lot of reasons for that. It's also very important to consider the topic of alexithymia, which is actually very common among offender-based populations. So you want to be aware of that topic. That's an emotional awareness processing deficit. I think it would be helpful to be aware of hormonal dysfunction. Tons of literature in the neurocriminology literature that talks about neurotransmitter dysfunction, neurohormone dysfunction, in particular, like learning about serotonin and dopamine and oxytocin and melatonin, these kind of things. Quite a bit of literature on sleep-related problems and criminality and even circadian rhythm misalignment. There's some literature that supports the fact that some of these sleep problems and circadian rhythm misalignment may be another factor to take into account when we're examining criminality. In the neurocriminology literature, it talks a lot about prenatal smoking exposure as well. Women who smoked during pregnancy, they have found that some of these children may be more prone to grow up and have more problematic outcomes, including an increased likelihood of maybe engaging in criminality at some point. I mentioned briefly before about glucose, but there are a number of studies that have talked about people that have difficulty metabolizing glucose in their body. It may be more related to aggression in some cases, self-control issues. So that would be something to take into account. Some studies have shown that low glucose levels can contribute to poor executive function and then trickle down into contributing to more criminal-based behavior. Low glucose levels have been studied within the context of anger, aggression, violence, irritability, marital problems. It's really fascinating literature. So I definitely recommend checking out some of the literature on hypoglycemia and insulin issues. That would be one I'd love to do for your audience at some point. That's where I'm spending a ton of my work lately, is in glucose and insulin. It's just fascinating area of study. And then the other area I would just highly encourage folks to start considering is the gut-brain health axis. And there are a few articles that are finally coming out and talking about the gut-brain health axis within the criminal justice system. There's very few that have talked about it, but there's thousands of articles on the gut-brain health axis within the context of everything you can possibly imagine. But becoming informed about the gut-brain health axis is very, very important, because if your gut is off, that impacts our brain. And there's a lot of things that impact the gut: stress, trauma, adversity, poor sleep, on certain medications, housing insecurity, loneliness, all kinds of things that can impact the gut. And a lot of these things are more common in criminal justice-based populations. So I suspect that you're probably working with folks with a lot of gut health issues, really on a semi-regular basis. And the last thing I'll say is one other topic you want to be aware of, if you want to start looking at this through a neurobiopsychosocial lens, something called biological despair. That would be something you'd want to learn about. Biological despair has been linked with more HPA axis dysfunction, autonomic nervous system dysregulation, problems with your immune system, and it's been linked with allostatic load, which is wear and tear in the body, which contributes to more premature aging. It's also been talked about within the context of obesity and hypertension and sleep issues, appetite problems, and pain disorders. So biological despair is kind of when our physiological state and our biochemistry is off. Over the long haul, if that's off for years and years and years, have you ever worked with a client who just looks decades older than what they are? I've worked with a lot of clients who've had a long history of homelessness. And I can think of one, I'll give you an example. I'm in my 40s. I worked with a client years ago who was about my same age. He literally looked 20 years older than me. I thought he was in his 60s. He had a long history of homelessness, smoking like it was going out of style, tons and tons of sugar. He had unmanaged diabetes. This basically is a prime example of what I'm talking about. You don't take care of yourself. You're not sleeping well. You have bad digestive health problems. You're dealing with chronic stress and worry. Your body starts wearing down over and over. And unfortunately, that can lead to premature aging, disease, and premature death. And if you study like the serious and persistent mental health literature or chronic long-term homelessness, you'll see studies say that folks that fall under that umbrella die between 10 to 20 years sooner than the general population. And part of that's the biological despair. It's just if you're running your car all day long, you never let it rest, you don't get oil changes, you put terrible gasoline in your car, you never get a tune-up, your car is going to break down. Same can be applied to the human body. So that's just kind of some of the neurobiopsychosocial factors taken into account. By no means is that all of them, but that's what we have time for today, unfortunately.
Jerrod, I know at one point, maybe it was when we were talking about interventions, but nonetheless, you suggested bringing in a consultant to look at some of these factors. It dawned on me that a lot of administrators and or practitioners were probably thinking, well, we can't afford that, we're out. But I would contend this is where the field is going, that, hey, listener, you yourself could be that consultant if you get the education and the training, which is a great segue, Jerrod, to some of the offerings that you have at Concordia University along those lines of being more neuroscience informed, learning more about neurocriminology.
Yeah, I'm infusing all of this into the coursework we're doing over there at Concordia for our trauma, resilience, and self-care program. We also have a forensic behavioral health program. These are both online master's degree certificate options. 100% asynchronous. Folks who sign up for this typically are within the helping professions. We've had folks in law enforcement, corrections, probation, psychology, all walks of life from human service. So being online, students are from all over the country. And we really break down complicated empirical-based research into practical application. Lots of lectures in there that I've pre-recorded, lots of educational handouts, discussion board questions, PowerPoint presentations, papers, all the things you'd expect with a grad program. We I think, do a pretty good job in bringing in the neuroscience literature into this, as well as criminal justice, psychology, human service literature into one umbrella.
And as I always do, I will leave a link for that program along with your contact information in the program description of this episode, so folks can check out those valuable resources. Jerrod, I know you teased a lot of future episodes, and I think when we get back to our infamous serial killer profile series, we talked about profiling Richard Ramirez, if I recall.
Yeah, the Night Stalker. So he is a great example of why it's so important to take into account the neurobiopsychosocial factors because of the extensive trauma he had, as well as, Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, I think his mom worked in a factory and was exposed to a lot of like fumes and chemicals, where they think that might have contributed to some issues as well. And then I believe he lived with a relative early on in life as well, and they're exposed to extensive violence and trauma and poor modeling. So he's a great example of biological factors as well as family, social factors that kind of converge under one umbrella. And then I think the next one we're doing too is looking at attachment theory and attachment dysregulation, which that's another huge topic which has significant relevance to everything we're doing, especially when you want to study human behavior.
And if you've never had a chance to catch any of Dr. Brown's serial killer case studies that we do, I can assure you we don't do this to exploit the lurid aspects of those offenses, but really do a deep dive on a lot of the topics indeed that we've talked about today. Jerrod, I was re-listening to the one we did most recently on Jesse Pomeroy, America's youngest serial killer, and it dawned on me after the fact that we barely talked about the offenses themselves. We did a deep dive on, again, a lot of the topics that we've talked about now, but it serves as a great template for people to relate to and perhaps even look at some of those same precursors in the populations that they're supervising. So I thank you for the approach you take.
Great example. Yeah, because he's a perfect example of looking at his early childhood. He had a lot of birth defect issues and early childhood illnesses and traumas. So he had that neurobiopsychosocial kind of deficits going on, and it converged and contributed to his heinous behaviors at such a young age.
Indeed, it did. Dr. Brown from Concordia University, I should mention you're also the CEO of APHIS, the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies. Thank you so much, my friend. Until we meet again.
You're welcome. Honored to be here. Thank you, Joe.
All right. Bye-bye, Jerrod. Big Criminologist podcast. Thank you to Dr. Jerrod Brown of Concordia University. Always a pleasure to have Jerrod on the show. He referenced we may be doing a profile of infamous serial killer Richard Ramirez in the future, so please stay tuned for that episode. Also very excited to announce I have scheduled interviews with Robin Moore and Tammy Burrows, who will be joining us all the way from the United Kingdom. Other future international guests include my dear friend, Juliana Carbonaro. She will be joined by Yana Sparrow, and the two of them will be telling us all about the great work that they do with the Confederation of European Probation. That's one you're not going to want to miss either. Meantime, as noted, I have left information for contacting Dr. Jerrod Brown, as well as information on his programs relating to so much of what we've talked about today at Concordia University. And a quick reminder, all of those programs are asynchronous. You can take all those programs online regardless of where you live, literally around the world. So please check those out if you are even the least bit intrigued about learning a little bit more about these fascinating topics in regards to what I personally think will be the future of probation. Back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, the Paragon Group, LLC.com, for training or presentations as to core correctional skills, implementation, or, of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. We are also on Twitter. Give us a follow at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. You may also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn, and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Hey, lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us, ask them to subscribe to the podcast, and of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
When we look at this research of neurocriminology, we're typically going to be in a better position to understand the neurological, the biological, the social, and the emotional factors associated with criminality. And if they're off biochemically, their brain is not working properly. And if their brain's not working properly, it's harder to take in cog skills groups, interventions, one-on-one approaches, because their brain is just not processing information the same as everyone else.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.